What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Cheeky Midweeky, where we are making strength and conditioning not boring. And we have, all right, part two, take two with Antonio. We're going to dive into VBT. You had been talking with me off air about this, and we've been texting about it for a while. What made that be something that you really wanted to dive in the nitty gritty with?
Well, that's a great question. Well, first of all, thank you for having me back. Hopefully the first one
This
wasn't
is
too
technically
boring.
the third time we've done it, because
It
the
is.
first time the internet was really bad for you. Then we were able to refilm. So you're a third timer now.
I like you. I like to spend time with you. So
My
that's
man, I feel the same way.
um, well, VBT. I'm probably biased because it is one of my favorite topics, or one of my favorite things to talk about when it comes to strength and conditioning. But like at the same time, I'm not all about velocity-based training. It's one of many tools. It's probably one of my favorites, together with uh, plyometric training and maybe Olympic lifts. But what I really appreciate about VBT is just how flexible of a tool that is and versatile. You can use it for program design, and it gives you a lot of help in that respects, because you can be more in tune with little aspects of, like, am I working on strength? Am I working on power? Am I monitoring for fatigue? It gives a lot of flexibility, but also it's a great assessment, because when you start using VBT, you start implementing that into your, I don't want to say daily routine, because I doubt anyone does VBT every single day. It's maybe once or twice a week. But once you start doing that regularly enough to have a track record, then it becomes almost like an embedded testing opportunity for your athletes to look whether or not they're fatigued, look if they're getting better. And if they are getting better, you can readjust the load just looking at the actual load that you're lifting and the velocity that the athletes are moving the weight at. So it's a built-in tool for program design and testing all in once, which I think it's as good as it gets in our field.
I agree, and I'm also biased. Like, people know that we've partnered with Vitruve, and there's a reason like that we've partnered with them is because I'm biased with them as the tool and the implementation, but also because, like you just said, all the reasons to use VBT. And like, just because, I mean, Dan Paff starts a lot of his conversations off with like, "Hey, I'm biased. We're all biased. Like, this is my bias is based upon my training and whatnot. Like, my bias in coaching was do all the Olympic lifts from the hang, because that's initially what I was taught, right? Like, so we all have bias with those things. I guess one of the questions that people probably have when it comes to VBT is, at what age should athletes start to actually use it before you're like, novice athletes just got to train, right? Like, it doesn't matter if they're on the speed strength or the strength speed curve, or does it? Like, from somebody, with your extensive background, what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. That's a question I get asked very often. I think we, uh, and that's my opinion again. So I'm not assuming to know the truth about anything, but I feel like when we're looking at younger athletes, and I think younger is a tricky word, because there's biological age and there's training age, and they
Mm.
both play a factor when it comes to velocity-based training. It's not just they're 16, they're young. Maybe 16 with 8 years of experience lifting, they may be better than a 32 years old with less experience lifting. So but nevertheless, velocity-based training is so specific with the adaptation that we need to look at chronological age, or biological age actually, to see if the type of adaptation is actually worth chasing, but also training age, meaning can they perform lifts with a decent amount of load at a certain velocity, which is definitely faster than your average lift, keeping good technique and moving the bar correctly and not risking getting hurt or anything like that. And that always comes first, because that's a safety matter. You need to make sure that your athletes are safe lifting the weight. So if you look at safety, I feel like as long as an athlete can squat maybe like half their body weight with decent technique and decent form, we're like keeping neutral spine, getting to full depth, moving at decent velocity, and they can do that without getting into any troubles, they can do VBT. They can start putting a linear position transducer on, and maybe they can start learning how to accelerate that load at a higher velocity. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have a target velocity to respect.
Mm.
Like if they're moving at zero point 0.5 or 0.8, that makes a huge difference. Just giving them a target to reach so they start putting intent with every lift, because lifting with intent is different than just lifting.
Yeah.
And that's something that needs to be somewhat learned and nurtured at a young age. So I deal daily with a lot of adult athletes that have no idea whether or not they're pushing their reps or not, because they've never been taught how to be intentional with every repetition, you know? So that's a learning opportunity in of itself. If we look at adaptation, and again, I might be biased on that, but I think there's a degree of scientific evidence to support that. We know that younger athletes, like, this is very young for girls because that can be as young as like 9, 10, 11. Maybe for boys a little later down the line, maybe like 13, 14, 15. They're like right before the spike in testosterone or hormones in general, where like you're not going to see much hypertrophy. You're not going to get a lot of like raw strength gains. However, they're very responsive to all sorts of like explosive movements. That's why if you look at the most recent papers on long-term athletic development, they usually recommend plyometrics at a young age because the load is less, has very little effect on muscle hypertrophy, but there's a lot of positive adaptation that comes from just modern unit recruitment and cutting rate and just being explosive. And if you think about velocity based training, now you have a tool that allows you to put load in the background. Like load is no longer your main priority, speed becomes your priority. You can choose a speed that is closer to your peak power output for a certain lift, so it becomes even more dominant toward rate of force development, explosive strength. So it's a win-win for younger athletes as well. The downside is that that speed usually is pretty high. We're close, like for a squat, that's about a meter per second, 1 meter per second. That's pretty fast.
Yeah.
So you need to make sure that they can move that weight at that speed without getting hurt. So, bottom line, I don't think there's necessarily an age that is too young to do velocity based training. It's just a matter of them being safe performing the lifts, having learned how to lift with intent, and then maybe kind of like right along their natural, like growing and developing phase to target maybe speed strength first and strength speed down the line when they're like 15, 16, 17, more experience, bigger muscle, maybe an actual need of developing strength. So it all comes in, I think, in the right sequence.
Keeping your certification is essential to staying hired as a strength and conditioning coach. Both of our long form courses, Fundamentals 1 and Fundamentals 2, offer CEUs to the NSCA, the NCSF, as well as the ASCA professional development points. Click the link down below to learn more about our education courses, which are both over 20 hours long and allow you to learn from some of the best practitioners in the field of strength and conditioning. You definitely just convinced me that younger athletes can use VBT because, like you just said, there's something so important about intent and not even just like, all right, we're doing dynamic effort or we're like, no, like, hey, the prescribed is the prescribed weight, even if we're doing a 1x20 and you're doing that number, but like, can you be dialed in and intentful on all of those reps? So that, bravo to you on that. I
Thank
bet you
you.
our listeners feel the same way. The
Thank you.
two things that I wrote down, plyos at a young age, like that would fly in the face of what a lot of people are like, oh, don't you have to have super strong, like, but I mean, kids do plyos on the playground anyways, and they sprint and they run. And then the other thing that I wrote was, where do you differentiate between should it be average, should it be peak when measuring on your LVT with Vitruve?
Oh, that's a
Like,
great. Those are two great questions. I'm going to start from the first one, the one on plyo,
okay.
and I'm going to go against what I normally believe in, which is NSCA textbooks and recommendations. But I do that for a reason, and I hope no one is going to get upset about that. Um, if you take the NSCA textbook, and I guess that's a great starting point for anyone to learn about strength and conditioning, plenty to recommend about that. However, there are certain things that are maybe biased toward research that is not necessarily applicable. And one of them is if you are, I think the recommendation is 100 kilograms or 220 pounds, you can't do high impact plyometrics, or you need to have a certain level of strength to do plyometrics at a younger age. Those are all recommendations that are based on, for sure, evidence. I'm not contesting that. For sure there's evidence to support that. However, it needs to be put in perspective. Like, let's take an example of a thrower, for instance, or a weightlifter, just to start from like easier examples. Tell me that 220 pounds weightlifter with a 3 times body weight squat can't do high impact plyometrics. They totally can. It's a matter of a progression. You can start them off with high impact plyometrics or depth jumps or drop jumps or all that good stuff. You need to progress them to a higher level of intensity. You have to prepare the tendons, the joints. Sometimes it's just a matter of like as simple as that, teaching them how to jump. Jumping, which is the common ground of plyometrics, is a skill, needs to be learned. You need to learn how to land, how to revert that movement, how to be explosive. But once you develop that progression towards a more intense plyometrics, there shouldn't be any limitation. And strength is sort of a limitation because when you look at high impact plyometrics, well, there's greater eccentric overload, which means that you have to have greater concentric strength to be able to tolerate that. So your 1 rep max bottom line needs to be heavy, needs to be higher. But guess what? That's part of your progression. If you start building that into your step-by-step approach to plyometric training, you're gonna get stronger. Your 1 rep max is gonna go up, and by the time it goes up, you'll be caught up with all things plyometrics, and you'll be able to do maybe like a depth jump from I don't know 50 centimeters, 60 centimeters. 3, 4, 5 years later, there you go doing depth jumps from more than a meter high, and you shouldn't be hurt. You shouldn't get hurt. It should be part of a progression, and the same applies to kids. Like you said, find me a 5, 6, 7 years old playing in a playground that doesn't do some sort of intro level to plyometrics. They all up around, lips around. Like our daughter is 15 months and she's already trying to like climb and jump and up and do all that stuff. It's part of it's called ontogenesis, part of the normal development of like motor skills. It's gonna be part of the way they cope with gravity at some point. It's just a matter of how much emphasis you can put on volume and intensity. That's what potentially creates a damage. Like, okay, they're hopping, it's body weight stuff. Keep it that way. Maybe start structuring some volume to it, some frequency to it, and then eventually build that intensity up because plyometrics is one of those few situations where it's absolute well, few situations. There are many situations. One of those situations where structure precedes function. You need to have a structure in place that is capable of tolerating a load before you can apply that load. You have to have strong tendons. You have to have strong joints to be able to take that load. So that volume aspects that create that structure adaptation is actually very important. So I feel like it all comes. It's a very boring answer. I know that, but it all comes down to progressions. Are you progressing toward a goal? Are you scaling your training interventions based on the level of the athlete you're working with? They're at that point, age and strength. It's not like they don't matter. They matter a lot, but they matter within that progression, and it all should take care of itself at the end of the day.
I couldn't agree with you more. Again, like especially if you have these younger, like you're doing these things, and especially if you like teaching them how to properly land from those heights, and then like you said, learn to kind of rebound off of it. Like it's a natural, good teaching progression. And who knows? I mean, you might even have an athlete that's world class that can't ever squat
Yeah.
that, but like they have to do it in their sporting demands. Like who knows what the Team USA, like who knows if Steph Curry can even squat that, right? Like maybe he can. I have no idea. But like he's clearly going to be doing that plyometric training and had been and blah blah blah. So we could talk forever on that one. But the average versus peak, where do you
Oh,
make the cutoff? What do you do with that?
sorry, I completely
No, you're
forgot about
good.
that
You're
part of the
good.
question. I get very passionate about plyometric training. I'm sorry. Um, so when it comes to, and I'm assuming you refer to all things like linear position transducer, accelerometers.
Yeah, so whether they're filming it with a video or the LVT, the LTV is on it, like whatever all the different technologies that's out there. But at what point do you choose to measure peak versus average velocity? And so, simplistic stakes, everything that I had been taught in my study was unless it's ballistic, so unless it's a jump, a clean, a snatch, or a jerk, it should always be average. But I have also heard I've heard that not always be the case. So that's why I want to ask you what is your opinion and what has any recent research said about it? taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about one of our sponsors, TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr has been my online software platform choice since 2019. Been using it at Towson, using it at Goldfinch, and use it with my online remote clients. You can learn more about them in the link down below. TeamBuildr is also part owner in the Plyomat, which will allow you to get quick, valid, and reliable jump data, jump height, ground contact time, and reactive strength index in just seconds. They are part owner of Plyomat, so you can check them out in the link down below as well.
I'm fully with you. That's what I was taught too, and honestly, that's what I kind of like learned through my experience as well. Um, I feel like it has a lot to do with whether or not it's allowed to decelerate at the end of the movement. Meaning, if you're doing something ballistic, like you just said, your goal is to have the greatest, let's call it velocity of release. You want to take off, you want to push off with the greatest velocity possible, because that velocity at takeoff will dictate, well, first of all, how much power you're producing, but also if it's just a jump or a throw, how high you're jumping or how far you're throwing. Like in track and field, if you're an expert on throwing events, you'll know that the velocity or release is the most predictable variable when it comes to the distance you're throwing the implement at. So it's a very important metric. And for that velocity to be the greatest possible, there needs to be the greatest acceleration possible. We know deceleration whatsoever. You want to fight against deceleration to be able to have that great velocity release. And I say that because that kind of creates an environment where, yes, your peak velocity might be a more vulnerable and less predictable metric than the average. I agree with that. If you look at the regular studies in biomechanics, they'll all show that uh, average velocity is always more consistent over time. But if you clear that by saying there is an intent of moving at the greatest velocity possible, no matter what, that kind of eliminates a lot of the background noise and makes that peak velocity actually reliable. But that would only be the case for ballistic movements, which is jumps, throws, and I myself like to throw in Olympic lift as well. Because it's true that you don't need to be leaving the ground when you do an Olympic pull. Your feet could potentially stay on the ground as long as you're pushing and you're creating that ground reaction force. However, the loads that normally corresponds to greater peak power output, which are not maximal loads, if you move them with a great degree of velocity, your feet are going to leave the ground. It's a consequence of you pushing very hard against the ground. So there is a ballistic component to the movement. On the other end, all other lifts that are not meant to be ballistics, where like there's a greater load, um, strength has a greater importance than velocity. The bar pad is somewhere like more standard in length and shape. For those movements, I just feel like it's easier, it's more predictable to use average velocity because it's less sensitive to little deviations in bar pad or bar distance. So it makes it more consistent. So that's the difference between the two lifts. So if you look at all the traditional barbell lifts, like squatting, deadlifting, pressing and pushing and pulling, those would probably be average velocity. All the ballistics would be peak velocity. Now, with that being said, there's one thing I've learned in my experience, I was taught, and I've always found useful or at least applicable, is how well you can prescribe loads and training intensity based on these velocities. You can do that with a great degree of certainty if you look at average velocity. You know that if you're targeting your strength, just for lack of better words, a simple example, that 0.5 meter per second can be a reliable metric to shoot for a number of different, like strength speed more than absolute strength, for like grinders or normal barbell lifts. Now, I wouldn't be comfortable saying the exact same for peak velocity because peak velocity is very sensitive to the technique of the lift, the bar path, the way you cope with that application of force through the movement. And if you look at a weightlifter, like sometimes they can move at the same identical peak velocity, but they can be handling different lifts because they're pulling higher, they're dropping lower more, or they're delaying more when they pull under the bar. So there's way to go around it that makes that number a little bit less predictable. So I would prescribe barbell lifts using average velocity, but then I would use on certain lifts, ballistic lifts, peak velocity when load is standardized. So when you're looking at the same load, the same movement, to look for progress. Because if on week one, I am putting all my intent to power snatch 70% of my mountain max at whatever 1.8 meter per second, and I do it, and after 3 weeks the bar path looks the same, the load is the same, but now I'm moving at 2 meter per second, well, I'm getting more explosive, it's showing progress, but I wouldn't use it necessarily to prescribe the load. I hope I answer somehow your question.
You did, and the thing that I wrote down there was in terms of grinders. Like I wrote it before, but me versus Nick DeMarco. We both work together at Iowa, and he is like I am type 1. I might have 2 type 2 fibers in my entire body. Like I literally two type 2s. The rest of them are type 1. Like I literally have completed a bench press when we were getting ready for a powerlifting meet. I've completed a bench where it said it read 0.09, like, so it was less than a tenth of it exactly. Like that's how, like, I can still. And so what I was getting to is, like, I know that there's the certain there's the ranges for accelerative strength, max strength, strength speed, and dirt, whatever words you want to use. And then there's the different speeds for height of the athlete, and then if it's a snatch, a clean, or a jerk. My question that I'm starting to get to is how do you respect the certain, like, okay, this is what it is, but then, like you just said, remembering that there's going to be outliers, people like myself, where it's like, hey, if my squat was a 0.4, like, no, that's moving pretty quick for me. Like I still got a lot in the tank. Like, is it really just knowing your athletes? Is it profiling them at a certain point? Like, what is best practices, your thoughts on all of that?
Profiling is the key word. You need to profile. That's what I teach all my students. You need to profile the athlete and profile the lift. Every lift for every athlete would have its own individual profile, and you need to know it because it's skill dependent, levers dependent, physiology dependent, because we can take two individuals of the same height, 100%, their bar path should be the same, but the way the angular displacement within the joints get to that movement is different based on arthrokinematics, insertion of the tendons and ligaments. Like, there's so much that goes into it that can affect the way the joints. At the end of the day, we're looking at a summation of forces, is a bunch of angular movements that happen at different joints, and together they give you that linear-ish looking bar path. And there's a lot of variability in all those single joints and how those joints interacts across kinetic chains. So you need to be able to isolate that. And I would add one more variable, which complicates things a lot, but it's something that I'm utterly convinced makes a difference between doing VBT and being great at doing VBT, is how you profile. And I learned that from many years of mistakes. So I've learned it doing it wrong many times. You need to profile the athlete. You need to profile the lift. And you have to make sure that when you do what is called as let's call it like a baseline assessment. For baseline, I mean, you want to do VBT, you want to find whatever weight the athlete can move at, let's say 0.5 meter per second. That's your target. That's what you want to get at. You need to make sure that at that specific moment in time that you're profiling, your athlete is capable of giving you 100% effort to move their weight, and there's no lingering fatigue preventing him or her from getting to move the heaviest weight possible at that velocity. And I say that for one reason, because let's say that you do this test in a state of mild to moderate fatigue, and now you have a number that you go by, and that number becomes your go-to when you go about program design. Let's say 100 kilograms or 100 pounds for at 0.5 meter per second. If that number was tested in a state of fatigue, then when you go and do auto regulation, which is something that normally happens when you do velocity based training, when the athlete is getting less fatigue, now you're undershooting your loads big time, and you're starting from a lower point, and you risk to incur eventually in undertraining your athlete. I don't think there's much of a risk of overtraining them, because you have red flags along the way that will prevent you from getting there. But undertraining becomes an issue. And I've experienced that plenty of times, because I do use velocity based training a whole lot. In every we use it with the Italian national team for throwers. We have 30 plus throwers in the team. I see their numbers weekly. We use it with the USA national team for track cycling. I've used it for the few weightlifters I work with. And before that, all college sports I work with. And I messed up plenty of times. And I realized that once you start looking at VBT as a source or a method for autoregulation, that difference in testing your athletes in a state of readiness, for lack of better words, makes a huge difference in the way you go about program design.
First question for that is, do you give them a mulligan then? So like, let's say you got me and I did 315 at 0.06. Yeah, 0.60. All right. Then you're like, all right, Justin, we're going to go 345. All right. Well, hey, I went 0.48. Would you let me try it again? Do I go, am I done? Like, how would you handle that situation?
For profiling, for testing?
For profiling, to, like you said, profiling and having me like, all right, you're trying to find me the heaviest weight that I can move at 0.5 meters per second squared. If I hit something and I'm just below it, like 4.7, 4.8, are you having me redo it? And if so, how long after would you recommend? Same thing with how long would you recommend in between bouts as you're getting closer to that number, that speed?
Okay. I'm going to take a little bit more time to answer this question, if you don't mind.
Please do. I've got my other questions written down right here. Don't you worry.
Hopefully we have enough time to cover everything. I feel bad.
We're good, bro. Don't you worry about this. If people don't want to listen, they can put it on ×2 speed or they can skip ahead. It's not there. It's there. I'm in it. I'm in it for the long haul.
Thank you. Same. Luckily, my wife is at home today, so if the baby wakes up, we're good. We're in a good place. So I give you my standard approach to profiling a lift. And based on that, I will tell you what I do if I find myself in that situation that you just described. So I usually go 4 sets of, let's say, a back squat. My first set would be 3 reps at 30% of water max. My second set would be 3 reps at 45% of water max. Then 3 reps at 60% of water max. And then 3 reps at 75% of water max. And they're all reps that are done usually with a brief pause at the bottom, so mostly concentric, usually. Then if the athlete is very good at lifting and squatting, like if you're dealing with weightlifters, I let them bounce. But otherwise, I try to standardize as much as possible. And after those 4 sets, in general, regardless of what velocity I got out of it, I give them 1 or 2 additional sets of 1 rep only. When I literally follow the guidelines from the NSCA, I go up by 15 to 20 pounds, depending on how the athletes feel. I give them 1 single rep, check the velocity, write it down. If the velocity is still somewhere like around 0.4, high 0.3, I go up again. I let them do 1 more rep, and that's where I end my session. And I use that so that I get at least 1 rep for which I have a load and a velocity that is closer to the limit of the lower limit of their velocity, so it becomes more predictive for their 1 rep max. So I don't have to test a 1 rep max. And that way I got done with that. I don't test 1 rep max unless I need to. Usually if I play my cards correctly, by this point in time, by the second single set, they are somewhere around 88, 92% of 1 rep max. So still pretty heavy, but not as heavy as they should go for an actual 1 rep max. And then I look at my data. I look at what I got in terms of velocities. Let's say the example you just gave me, I got them a 75% of 1 rep max. I was hoping to see a 0.5 meter per second because that was my target. And I didn't get to a 0.5 meter per second. I have 2 rules, and I kind of like, and I hope Dr. Brian Mann is not going to call me back after this episode and say like, you got it completely wrong. You said it wrong. I hope not. But that's something that I learned from him. And if I learn it wrong, I'm the first one to apologize. Has worked so far. So hopefully I got it right. I look at the velocity, and let's say my target velocity was 0.5. If it's anywhere between 0.45 or 0.55, so plus or minus 0.05 meter per second, I'm happy with that. I'll take it. I don't bother. That's what it is. That's what I use. If I'm either higher or lower, more than 0.05, I take every 0.05 meter per second increment and I count them, how far off I am, and I just multiply or add 5% to the load that I was using. And that way, Again, maybe I learned this a little wrong. I'm not the greatest at math and stats and astronomics, whatever that science is, but so far I've been pretty damn close to be accurate in the sense that, let's say I take, my goal was 0.5. I moved 200 pounds at 0.6. I didn't get 0.5. That's two jumps of 0.05. So I take the load, I add 10% to it, and usually that load brings me pretty close to 0.5. It's, I feel fairly comfortable in teaching this in class too because I've done it long enough that I know it works pretty well. I think it's also backed up by science. Don't quote me on that, but it should be.
I mean, but that makes sense because based off that math, like if you're now going to ask that athlete to do 220, in theory, they're going to be pretty, like they'll probably be really close to 0.50.
They should. I'm a very down to earth, simple kind of guy. Like, if I
No,
doubt it,
that makes a ton of sense. I mean, yeah, and you could even then just say like, all right, you 0.5, like the 0.05 is 5%. Like honestly, the 0.01 is just a percentage point.
yeah. And I know
Huh.
there are people that are good in math that are gonna call me and say you got it completely wrong. You don't understand what we're talking about. It's fine, but
But
it
like
works
now
in
that's
practice.
where I'm going to go mess around with my Vitruve unit and like see how it works for me, you know?
There you go.
Like the other thing that, how do you account for, and I think this is Brian's stuff, where it's the 17% variability within the day. Like the fact of like, okay, you could have tested me and maybe I did hit, 200 pounds, 0.05, but like now understanding that, shoot, tomorrow I could be smoked based on practice or for whatever reason. Like, how do you deal with that?
First of all, can I say that I love Dr. Brian Mann? Is a great person, and I can't speak well enough about him because he's great, amazing, awesome.
Couldn't
Uh,
agree more. He is all over strength. He's done multiple presentations inside the webinars for Strength Coach Network, and he is one of. I mean, he's been in both of our long form courses, fundamentals 1 and 2. Like, so
he's great,
big fan of Dr. Brian Mann here too.
huge fan. I need to make sure I said that. Now let's move on variability. Um, it's true, and I can guarantee you, there's a lot of variability from day to day, from week to week in the numbers that we collect. So, and I'm going to be honest, this is something that I didn't come up with. I took it from Natalia Verkozhansky, from one of the many conversations I had with Joseph, and I just tweak it a little bit to be able to apply that with my own measurements. So I don't take credit for anything. I just applied using a different metric. That's it. Um, so Natalia Verkozhansky told me this little story that back in the days when she first started helping her dad working with athletes, they used to have a quote unquote portable device, which wasn't that portable, was a struggle to carry it around, but she was carrying it around. And it was nothing different than,
Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about one of our sponsors, Hawkin Dynamics. I've had Hawkin Dynamics for multiple years, dating back to my time at Towson, and still utilize them here at Goldfinch when I'm training athletes in Iowa. Hawkin Dynamics makes it simple to be able to get input to find out what's going on underneath the hood with your athletes. Whether it's lower body assessment, upper body assessments, you want reliable data to find out how the athlete is putting force into the ground so you can be able to accurately return an athlete from an injury, and you can also find out how the athlete is producing force to check how your training is working. Check out Hawkin Dynamics in the link down below.
a dynamometer slash force plates combined that they use to test plantar flexion in a very standardized manner, get the peak isometric force during plantar flexion, and they were using that to assess readiness on a day-to-day basis. And they would perform certain tests or certain exercises. In particular, when I had this conversation with her, we were addressing the depth jump, the true depth jump, the big time, big box depth jump. They would only do that in the volume that Yuri Verkhoshansky used to prescribe, the 4 sets of 10 or whatever the case may be, if their level of readiness for the day was significantly above average. So they would do that isometric test. They would have a baseline level for, let's say, their average was 200 newtons. I'm just throwing numbers out there. They would have a coefficient of variation or a standard deviation above and below, let's say maybe like a 10%. So the range of confidence would be 220, 180 above and below. If it was above that 220, for them was a green light. We're in a good place. There might be some variability, but at least I'm assuming I'm protecting, I'm covering my back by saying the athlete is in his or her best condition to be tested or to be trained. And I do the same thing with VBT. When I profile, and that's part of my system. So it's not something that I have to deviate from my day-to-day routine to do it. It's part of my day-to-day routine anyway. We always test for readiness, and we do that with standard counter movement jumps. We have a backlog of data. So for every athlete, we know a mean and a standard deviation above and below, and we update that on a weekly basis by doing a rolling average. So when I have them walk in the weight room and I say, okay, today's day 0 of your new program, I want to test you and I want to profile, let's say, a back squat, put you on the force plates, I ask you to jump. If your best is, your average is 40 centimeters and your confidence interval is 44 to 36, if you're not at 44 or above, I don't even bother about profiling you. I want to wait for the day when I know I have you in the best condition possible for me to test you. Is that going to eliminate that degree of variability? Absolutely not. That degree of variability is going to be there. But at least I pick a method that gives me a consistency in the way I go about testing my athletes over a prolonged period of time. Because at the end of the day, yes, we can complicate things as much as we want, but the more we complicate them, the more difficult it is to implement all these cool things. We need to come to a middle, like meet halfway where it's scientifically robust enough to give us good data, but it's not so cumbersome that we can't possibly work our way around to be able to use it and apply it, so it's a little bit of a balance.
Yeah, no, I mean that I agree with you. And like hearing you say that, the thing that I thought of, like, okay, anybody in the team sport world might be like, well, how do I handle that? Like, okay, I planned on doing it today, and the coach is in practice. Like, yeah, I mean, I guess it's just get like, okay, the answer is be able to have more people on staff. So we, as a profession, we working with the NSCA, help continue to put. I mean, our field is still in the infancy, but
Yeah,
that's how you can actually do right by the athletes. So that way you can do it instead of collecting false data, because, or like bad data. No data is better than no data is better than bad data, is what
totally.
I've been told, and I believe that.
100%. And I guess you said the most important thing for any young practitioner coming to the field: the athletes come first. Everything we do is in the best interest of the athletes. It's not for us to look good. It's
Yeah,
not for us.
we're doing this not just to do it. It's like, no,
Totally.
so that way we're giving you the right load, because as I came to understand VBT, it's like, hey, instead of like, okay, the best way to train athletes is truly based off of their nervous system and if they feel good or not. But you really can only do that with the athletes that you know and trust and have been around you for a while. And with them, it's like, no, we're not. I'm not prescribing you, 80% for 5 sets of 5. Like, no, I'm going to prescribe 5 sets of 5 in that quality that we want to train. But for you, Antonio, that speed strength is higher because, hey, Lima, he's a grinder, so his reps, they can be at 0.03. But Antonio, if you start dipping in the 0.45s, like, no. And so that's where, yeah.
And if I may, I'll be quick,
Oh,
but
you're good.
you gave a great example of 5 sets of 5 at the right load, at the right velocity. I would take it a step forward and say, who even tells me that 5 sets of 5 is what you can handle at that day? Maybe 2 sets of 3, maybe 10 sets of 4. Even volume becomes a variable. And I feel like velocity based training serves you to adjust the load for that particular day by looking at velocity loss, intraset and interset velocity loss, and start getting more familiar with the concept of, that's something that like I really struggle to present in any other way, because when we talked to the Bosco family and we translated this book, there were certain things that simply did not translate in English. So we had to come with a term or a terminology to address some of those topics. And one thing that Carmelo Bosco didn't even name, so it was very difficult to reproduce in a different language, was the way he used to use velocity-based training. The way he created that was not to figure out your target only, but was to figure it out how many sets, how many reps, and how long the rest periods was supposed to be for every exercise, for every day of the week, for every training cycle. And that was exclusively based on average velocity and velocity loss. And when I had to put this into like a more understandable way, because like in Italy we like to write with long, complicated sentences that don't translate well in English. So I had to come with a shorter nickname, if you will, for this approach. And we agreed on this nickname being open sets, which means that you don't know how many sets you're doing, you don't know how many reps you're doing. Everything is based on the velocity target, a load that corresponds to that velocity, and that comes from profiling, and a controllable variable, which is your rest periods between sets. Everything else is up to the athlete up for that day. Whatever the athlete can do based on his or her level of fatigue, that's the volume you're going to get. So it gets extremely down to the individual athlete in the very specific day what they can tolerate. And that makes training a whole lot more complicated, complex, cumbersome, but also extremely rewarding in the end. So I'm not here to recommend everyone to do it. It's a very advanced approach to VBT, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind and just maybe start thinking about.
Well, one of the things that I thought of in terms of ways that it makes it easier is, again, I'm biased. I've used TeamBuildr for years, had them since 2019. They made using Excel obsolete because, like, when I was at Iowa and Maryland, and you had like, okay, we don't have a barbell incline or a dumbbell incline bench max. We would take your bench press max multiplied by 80% divided by 2. Versus TeamBuildr, now you can just set, hey, your dumbbell bench max, you can actually have a number because it's pulling from a database. You can do the exact same thing with your VBT on the input of it too. So now it is easier to actually individualize. And when you start, wanting to put in those things, because again, that's where you do it. You have the bigger staffs. You have like anybody that's working in American football. If you're Division I or the NFL, like the average NFL strength and conditioning staff size is 5 or 6. So with that number of people, like you can do you can do right by the athletes is what I'm trying to say.
I 100% agree. 100%. I mean, I'm nowhere to say like this is what I do, this is what I don't do, but in my little experience, like I've managed VBT with one LPT device and 9 athletes at the same time in the weight room, looking at all these variables by myself. It can be done. It's time consuming. Your head is exploding by the time you're done with a session, but it can be done. So on a bigger team with a bigger salary, with a bigger budget, with more staff members on board, paid members, interns, assistants, whatever the case may be, there shouldn't be a reason why you can't have this level of control over your training session.
How about when doing like jerk, when you and I remember this, if we're ever doing hang clean to a front jerk or split jerk, whatever, sometimes read it twice. Like, are you on movements like that with a clean and jerk? Are you wanting to see different speeds, considering the fact that a clean you have longer time to produce force to then produce a higher speed? What are you recommending for our listeners that have um, speed tracking on a movement like that?
Well, I'll be very careful in giving any recommendations just because I don't really use VBT much for Olympic lifts. So
Okay.
I don't have a ton of experience with that. But the only piece of recommendation I will give is make sure you standardize your approach as much as possible, because when we say, like for instance, like a power clean into a jerk, yes, great movements, different bar path, so you expect different outcomes when it comes to, but the load is the same. You have the same bar on you, like that bar is not going to change. So the way you cope with that velocity depends on exclusively bar path at that point, unless you change your technique or you change the way you go about the lift. So make sure that whatever velocity you're looking at has to be associated with the way you perform that lift, like the depth of your dip, the extension that you get, the rebound, the drop below the bar, underneath the bar when you catch that bar. All those little things can skew the results a lot when you look at velocity. So make sure that that's not that much of a problem when you're doing a squat, because the end of the movement is the end of the movement unless you're jumping, and the bottom of the movement is a deep squat. That's easy to standardize. Like you can look at knee angle, position of the thigh. You can even put a box. You can have your athlete tap it. It's very easy. But Olympic lifts, everything happens very, very fast. Power requires a lot of jerky, quick, deep and drive type movements. So there's a lot that an athlete needs to be able to manage and keep in mind when it gets very difficult to standardize things. So the coach eye really makes a huge difference when it comes to this lift, to make sure that the data you're collecting are actually actionable. Like you can do something with it, they're not dependent on the degree of variability between one rep and the other.
We've been diving down this rabbit hole for like it. I can't believe it's been 45 minutes. It doesn't seem like it's been that long.
It doesn't.
Was there something that we did not talk about with respect to this that you're like, I really wish, like, I wanted to make sure that we talked about this part of it, because I wanted to make sure that, like, because again, you were like, hey, I really want to like talk about this topic. Was there something that you're like, hey, we didn't discuss yet? Like, bring it up right now.
Uh, I think we had a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed every second of it. Uh, my wife is laying next to me. I don't think she appreciated the same amount of conversation we just had. But
if she I don't know if she needed a nap, but she definitely just got one.
totally, 100%. Um, there's one thing that I would like to add. We touched on many different topics, and they're all, I think, very interesting. At least I find them very interesting. And I really appreciate you sharing your perspective on things too, because it's always good to have a conversation about these things. We don't have the right answer for not anything. The more we talk, the more we can get closer to the right answer. But with that being said, I'm a huge fan of EBT. Be using a long time. Love every second of it. I think it's a great tool. However, I've noticed that, and I say that with no sense of, there's no negative connotation to it. It's just an observation. I've noticed that the younger generation of practitioners, and in particular those who learned about velocity based training in school, because I learned it at work. I didn't learn about VBT in school. I learned it by doing it. There's a new generation now that is learning that in school, because we have a lot of papers, some textbooks, part of manuals that went out. They get very excited, and that excitement is genuine because they want to do good at their job. They want to be good practitioners, and they've learned all these good things about VBT. They think VBT is the next big thing, and that's all they want to do. They get their hands on a linear position transducer. They're super excited that now they can do that, and they're so like laser focused on VBT that they lose sight of all the other important things that need to go in a program. Like VBT, I always teach my students that's your 80-20. I think that's the way you say it. It's 20% of your volume that gives you 80% of the results. It's a great tool. It's a wonderful tool, extremely powerful tool in the weight room, but it can't be all you worry about when you do your program. You need to keep the heavy lifts. You need to keep those grinders. You need to keep the plyometrics. You need to keep the Olympic lifts, speed, power, and agility. VBT, if that's all you do, is only going to get you better at VBT, specific adaptation to impose demand. If you want to like cover a broader spectrum of adaptation where you see improvements in strength, in power, in speed, in vertical jump height, in linear speed, acceleration, then you need to implement all these elements in your program. You can't forget about the foundations. You need to continue lift heavy every now and again. You need to continue with your extensive plyometrics, as boring as it may be, still part of what you need to do. You need to have your intensive plyometrics, your shock method if you need to. You have to have room for some sort of accommodative resistant training of Olympic lift to really work on that rate of force development, longer ground contact time. All those good things, you need to have them in your program. You can't just focus on VBT and that's all you do. At my best, on the best week of the year, when I have all the time that I want to work with the athletes I work, I maybe do squats with VBT twice out of 4 workouts. It's not all I do. It's 2 sessions and 1 exercise per session. That's it. But I know that if I do that well, and if it's supported by everything else the athlete needs, then those 2 days of squatting are going to give me a whole lot of return of investment, because they're exactly what the athletes need to bring their power production at the next level. So just look at the bigger picture. Look at the bigger picture. VBT alone doesn't suffice. You need to have everything in place for VBT to give you the results that it's supposed to give you.
That's a good point about college, though, because yeah, I didn't learn about VBT until I was at Harvard in 2011. Like, it wasn't taught in school, but now it is.
So my first approach to VBT, funny story, sure, quick, uh, was my first day. I didn't have a job yet. I was interning at Villanova University. My first day interning at Villanova University. I walked in the weight room and I saw this guy leaving with a big suitcase on his back. I talked to the head coach and I asked who that person was. And that person was a representative for a company that back then used to sell VBT device. I'm not going to name it, that just came to Villanova and dropped 6 units for the team to use it. And the coach looked at me and he said, I have no clue how to use it. He told me everything about it. I forgot. So here it is. Enjoy. Learn how to use it. It's your responsibility from now on. So that's how I learned how to do VBT, and I took it one step at a time. Tried to get better.
OTJ, baby, on the job training.
So I learned it the hard way, and I see that now students come to me, and by the time they're like 20, 21, they already know about like the difference between peak velocity and average velocity. I never even asked myself that question. I was like 25, 26, 27, and now they're so well versed. Like soon after college, it's very good. It's awesome. I'm happy to see that. That makes me feel very, very good about the future of our profession. But at
That's
the
a good
same
point.
time, it can be a little bit too much enthusiasm before they get enough experience to support their decisions.
It's a great point, brother. Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about one of our sponsors, Vitruve VBT. With Vitruve, you can accurately measure what speeds your athletes are moving the bar. No longer do you have to program simply based on sets and reps. You can program for your more mature athletes based on the velocities that they are hitting. You can accurately measure at a great price with Vitruve, and you can have this integrate with your TeamBuildr, making it simple so you no longer have to write down the recorded reps from other devices. Everything in one place with Vitruve VBT. Check them out in the link down below. Antonio Squillante, you are back. Round 2. We got good internet. We're ready to roll, brother. Thank you very much. How's life
Thank
been?
you. Thank you for the patience. Now we have good Wi-Fi. Our computer is plugged in. We're good to go. There should be no problem. Baby's sleeping, so I have a good hour and a half free to chat.
Very nice. So, how was the trip overseas for the NSCA?
It was very good. It was a bit busier than I anticipated, but in a good way. Um, we had a very strong presence at FIBO. You and I briefly mentioned. Are you familiar with FIBO?
A little bit.
It's think about it like in terms of maybe the Arnold Classic of fitness, if you will. It's a big expo, um, encompasses everything. It's fitness and strength and conditioning related, from equipment to supplements to courses, education, all that stuff. The biggest event in Europe, has been for the last 20 years or so. This year was the first time that strength and conditioning was actually presented as a topic, uh, which is huge because we take it for granted here in the States. It's not in Europe. So we had like roundtable and discussions and presentations and whatnot. It was great. NSCA had a strong presence. We had 7 or 8 foreign affiliates coming to attend. Um, Japan, we had Korea, Spain, well, Germany, of course, Italy. We did some talking. We did some meetings too. Lots of good things are happening in Europe. We're actually working on an extension of the CSCS certification now. It would be called the CSCS P, which is a distinction that is created just for Europe. That means practitioner, and that includes a hands-on component. The certified practitioner in Europe to be competent in not just prescribing resistant training, but also coaching resistant training and all things training conditioning. So lots of things are happening and are all very exciting.
How difficult, like you said, we in the States don't fully understand, like, what is there pushback? Is it just because like people in Europe don't understand strength? Like, what is it? And the reason I ask, and I also ask this with a caveat that you and I talked about it, but I don't think most of our listeners know. I'm first born here in the States. Like, my dad is an immigrant. His entire family immigrated from the Azores to the United States when he was 10 years old. So like, it's super interesting to me because I have that European background. Like, my dad, like, we've gone to the Azores before. We're going again next year. So like, I'm curious, to help make the profession better, but I'm also curious as somebody who has that international aspect in my own life.
Yeah, I think I had this conversation with some of my students a while back when they often ask me to compare the US and Europe in terms of strength and conditioning. I think it's there are many different reasons why strength and conditioning is a bit behind in Europe. And I think the biggest one is lack of endorsement from professional sports. Like if you think in the States, the the process of making strength and conditioning a profession was the endorsement the strength and conditioning practitioner received from, let's say, professional football, like American football, which is one of the biggest sports. It's not the only determining factor, but was one of the determining factors. In Europe, if you look at the main professional sports, soccer, basketball, volleyball, um, they hardly ever have a strength and conditioning coach. And if they do, it's not necessarily a dedicated uh, practitioner, is more someone in the team that takes on the responsibility as well, that does some strength and conditioning. So if you think about the top down progression, like if the top teams don't endorse strength and conditioning, it's very unlikely that minor teams would, even less universities where there's no organized sports like in the States. So the entire system is a little bit different, and it lacks that depth of practice that we have in the States. uh, like part of what I do is teaching and research too. If I were to compare research and science in Europe, in our field, it's excellent. Like I would never say they're behind. Like some people make the claim they're 10 years behind. They're not. When it comes to research and science, they're just as good as we're in the States, if not sometimes better, because their ability and access to athletes is for research is better than here. What they lack is the practical component because again, there's no endorsement, so there's no way for people to actually practice this job. Um, for a student to graduate from university and think like I am going to be a strength and conditioning coach, it's not even an option. There's not a career path built for them. They can become like a physical education teacher. They can become a personal trainer. They can maybe become professors. And on the side, if they're lucky, get into a team that for a minimum wage allows them to do some strength and conditioning. And that's the extent of it. So it's a pretty significant difference in culture that then translates and carries on like the way the educational system is built around it, or lack of educational system, if you will, and all the consequences for practitioners.
Hearing you say that though, like I can instantly draw parallels between what you're trying to build over there with other coaches and any coaches nowadays that are trying to build buy-in with their sport coaches. Like there's clearly parallels and carryover, right?
Yeah, there is. I think we are in how do I say that nicely? I think we're in a similar situation. It's just a matter of developing on one end, probably on our end as practitioners, the soft skills to communicate with people that are outside our circle. And for outside our circles, I mean people that don't understand sports science or strength and conditioning. If you take the average football coach, soccer coach, basketball coach, head coach, they know the sport very well. They might not understand strength and conditioning. They might not understand physiology and all that good stuff. So on our end, it's a matter of developing those soft skills to communicate with them. And I feel like I don't want to get into a rabbit hole, but sometimes in the pursuit for like authority or accreditation in the industry, we tend to complicate things a little bit too much in the way we communicate with others. We really want to showcase that we went to school, we actually have a degree, maybe a master, maybe a PhD or whatnot, and we tend to complicate things a lot in the way we communicate. I guess maybe it's a little bit of lack of confidence that comes with the territory of like not being, not having been recognized for a long time as professionals in our industry. Um, and that makes it even more difficult to communicate with coaches. So I think developing the soft skills of delivering messages that have to do with strength and conditioning and sports science in a very simple manner and a practical one goes a long way. Goes a long way in our industry. So that's kind of our side here in the States. In Europe, it's kind of like the same tools, same soft skills, but on the opposite end, building value for what we have to do because there's not a demand for us. There's not a demand for practitioners in our field because there's no appreciation and understanding of what our role is. And I love the way you made an introduction for the podcast. Our job is awesome. Our job is wonderful.
Yep.
There's plenty to recommend about our profession, with all the ups and downs that come with it, like the years spent interning, not making money, being overworked. It's all great. It's plenty to recommend in terms of life experience and work experience and personal growth. But when we step foot in a weight room and we're there to make those athletes healthier, better, performing at their best, exploiting their capabilities as humans, what else could you want? Like, we do what we love. We're paid more or less adequately for that, but we can make a living for it. In other places, people can't make a living doing our job, so we need to consider ourselves very lucky. And if we want to give back to our profession, we need to make sure that other people can enjoy the same worldwide. Like, I want everyone. If my daughter one day wants to become a strength and conditioning coach, and she wants to do that in Italy, Spain, Germany, whatever the case may be, I want for her to have the same opportunity that I had in the States. And I think it's a fair ask.
Agreed. And you talked about the research. Let's talk about research, here in the States and overseas. Like, what are you seeing as a researcher in terms of the ability to conduct research? Because like you said, it's not as easy as everybody. And I know I've been guilty of it. When I first started reading research, it's like, oh, how hard could it be to get, it's like to write an IRB, to get them to approve it, to get like, it is not easy. Can you talk about that? Because you clearly have a better experience with it than I do.
No, I don't know if I have a better experience. I think we share the same experience with that. In the States, it's very cumbersome, to say the least. I don't want to say that with a negative connotation, because we also need to keep in mind that, yes, it's very difficult to do research. It's extremely difficult. It's even more difficult to do good quality research because, like, one thing is doing a study to say that you have an abstract or a paper. One thing is to carry on a study that's actually advanced in the field. Two completely different things.
Yep.
Different magnitude of effort and budget involved. So on one end, we're extremely lucky because research is part of what academic institutions do in the States. And as such, we as PhD students or even master students, we have constant exposure to research. We can learn how to do research. But then again, the downside of it is that sometimes that research is diluted to the point that it's not necessarily meaningful.
Yep.
In Europe, we don't have the same access to research. We don't. It's not common for an institution to have people doing research, even less having funds to support research. But on the other end, when research does happen, it's a little bit more, how should I say, task oriented or goal oriented. We're like, okay, now we're investing some time and resources. Let's actually find an answer to this question. Let's not just get data just for the sake of getting data. Let's make it as applicable as possible. So sometimes ends up being a little bit more meaningful and impactful in the actual findings. It's not uncommon in Europe to see research being done on elite level athletes. It's way more uncommon in the States for many constrictions and limitations that come with professional sports. If we look at certain countries that are somewhat a little bit more advanced, if you will, when it comes to research, like the UK, Australia, there's more of an appreciation for the need to include elite athletes in research in strength and conditioning. Let's put it that way. Because, like, I'm a huge motorsport fan. And yes, if you want to become a good mechanic, you can learn how to fix your 2015 Toyota Corolla. That will work just fine. But if you want to become an excellent mechanic or an engineer, you probably want to learn how to work with an IndyCar or an F1 or a NASCAR, because that will show you what the system does when you push the boundaries, when you push the limits. And that expose the weaknesses of the system, but also its ability to adapt to a different level. And if you want to practice strength and conditioning, no matter if you practice that in a high school environment or setting or with athletes working in the Olympics, you need to know what the top of the pyramid is to be able to downscale your interventions to whatever situation you're working with. And we lack that very much so in research in the States at this moment in time. Like, if we look at papers, I know you do just as much as I do. And when we claim we make evidence-based practice or we pursue evidence-based practice, we probably know how to train the average 21 to 25-year-old white man that goes to college. That's what we know. They're not necessarily athletes. There's not a diverse population, let alone we know pretty much nothing about the female athlete, or very little. There's a massive bias in research, even less interest in diversity and equity, which is a big problem. So we have a lot of issues to address when it comes to research. One of them being also looking at elite level athletes and having access to these athletes to learn what the process involves when we're working with the top 10% of the population.
And what I've also realized is just the fact that you're trying to add now another thing to their plate, like because they've got practice and they've got this. And again, like you could do it with professional athletes in terms of they don't have as many requirements. They don't have to go to school, right? They have families, but it's like if you're going to do an intervention with, let's say, an NFL team or an NBA team, teams are so obsessively just like, oh, we don't want you to like, no, like privacy. And it's just like, we're not doing like, none of this is going to reveal who it was. Like in anything, we're just trying to, push the field forward, but it's, I don't know, like nothing that is going to be said in a research paper is going to show like why you won a Super Bowl or an NBA
Correct.
championship. Because let's call it what it is. Even the most star-studded teams don't win the champion. Like, and if this recipe was that simple, like you just copy and paste what, like, listen, the Kansas City Chiefs, they're very successful right now in NFL. The New England Patriots used to be. It's not as simple as just keep doing what you've always been doing. It ain't that. Like, so I do agree with you where it's like, man, how can we start pushing it forward and doing things? But realistically, it's tied to people that have nothing to do with strength and conditioning. It's the owners, it's the GMs that will or won't allow it.
Maybe one day things will change when like the current generation of practitioners will be in a position of, let's call it power, if you will. Having coming from a generation where these issues were addressed, because now we talk about these issues. Like 10, 15 years ago, it was like it was there. We knew we couldn't do research, but no one was really talking about it. Whereas now we're more vocal, we're more proactive in trying to make a difference. Maybe 10, 15 years down the line, students that are currently working and struggling doing research will be in a position where they will make research accessible at a higher level too. That's my hope. I really have a lot of hope in the future generations. And I think we're doing very good in fostering personal and professional development in our industry nowadays, more than we used to do 10, 15 years ago. So I'm very confident in the future. I think our future is bright as practitioners, at least.
One of the things that you have been able to do is do some work with Joseph Johnson and Ultimate Athlete Concepts in terms of being able to help transcribe and bring to life some of these older texts. And we had Joseph on the show and talked about some of these legendary coaches. Like I want to hear your opinion about some of these coaches and some of these texts that some of our listeners are young. Like you said, maybe they're 18 to 21-year-old as strength coaches. They don't even know some of these names. Like I kind of want to sit back and let you kind of take these coaches to school and, educate myself as well.
I would love to. And I love Joseph. He's a good friend of mine. He's a great person. Uh, Amazing human being. He has done a lot for me. So uh, I watched the episode. Great that you guys connected. Uh, we talk often. Great person. Plenty to recommend when it comes to like interacting with him. He's a great human being.
Yep.
With that being said, yes. So let me take it a step back. I remember, and I said that with, especially for the younger generations. A few years ago, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, I was involved with the NSCA weightlifting SIG, the special interest group.
Yep.
And weightlifting, it's a topic in strength and conditioning that is very much rooted in tradition. Like in a way, we kind of like come from weightlifting and powerlifting, so to speak, in a certain way, or at least a lot of the first pioneers in this field were weightlifting enthusiasts or powerlifting enthusiasts. So very often when we were having discussions on Facebook or sharing content or articles or books or whatnot, I was always going back to either some of the good research from the past, like the work that Joseph is doing with translating some of, even preserving some of the original work from the likes of Verkhojanski, Bosko, Bondarchuk, all those big names. Or I was referring to some of the coaches that are pretty much like, I want to say like almost influencers, or
old school influencers, if you will, in our field, like Mark Ripto or Louis Simmons, guys that never did research, but they did a lot of work in pioneering our field. And the answer I was constantly getting from this younger practitioner or younger researcher was like, what do you care about them? Ripto never published a paper. Verkhojanski did studies in the 60s. Um, Louis Simmons never even walked in a high school. I was getting all these sorts of comments from people with PhDs and people that publish. I said, dude, stop a second. We have a job, we have a career because of these people. We wouldn't be where we are, we wouldn't be who we are without the Louis Simmons, the Mark Ripto, the Verkhojanski, the Zachowski. Like, they created our field, they pioneered our field, they single-handedly developed a profession as it is today. Like, we need to respect them. I get that. Verkhojanski published some of his paper in the 60s and 70s. We know better now. Verkhojanski didn't even believe in muscle hypertrophy. I get that. We know better now. But we can't just dismiss their work because it's outdated. Like, we still need to respect that. And there's still plenty to learn from their work. Like, the most influential book I've ever read, and that's why I actually offer Joseph to translate it, besides Super Training, because I think Super Training is like a milestone. Everyone needs to read that book. I've read Super Training, I don't know, maybe like 20 times. I cried a few times reading it. It's a tough book. It's not an easy read. Uh,
No, not even
it's
a
an
little.
ever evolving book. Like, every time you read it, it looks different. It feels different. It tells you something different. It's a great book. It's like evolving with you. But besides Super Training, which I mean, it's a great book. The second best book I've ever read was written by Carmelo Bosco, which is an Italian physiologist who spent his career in Finland working with the likes of like Keijo Akinen, Paavo Komi, Verkhojanski himself. The guy had 3 PhDs, no one, three. Was like as deep in research as he possibly can be. And when I first read his book, which was written the first time in 1986, second edition was 1994, it's called Muscular Strength. It's a very simple title, very simple book, very thick. I was expecting to be, well, of course, it was heavy on physiology, heavy on biomechanics, heavy on endocrinology, but I was expecting to be like one of those books that normally like researchers write, very academic, very like science heavy. But as I was reading through it, it felt like I was talking to a coach. Like, this guy was deep in research, was working with some of the best athletes in Europe in track and field and team sports in the 70s and 80s, athletes that at the bare minimum won the Olympics. So some of the best athletes in the world. It was doing research with some of the best researchers in Europe at that time, but yet he always kept a very down to earth, applied side to things that he was explaining in his books. And I feel like that's something that we've lost over time. Like, more modern textbooks and articles and papers are great when it comes to the science, but they're very weak when it comes to the practical application. Whereas if you read Verkhojanski, if you read Bosco, if you read Bondarchuk, Zacharski, yes, there's a lot of very good science, but they're always very easy to apply at the end. Yes, they talk about physiology. Yes, they talk about bioenergetics. They talk about endocrinology, all these complex things. But at the end, they list set, reps, loads, exercise, rest periods. You can turn that knowledge into a program. You can design a program based on what you learn in that book. So, one piece of advice I give to all the young students: don't ever dismiss old textbooks just because they're old. And sometimes not even like necessarily like university textbook, like Starting Strength, read it. Or Louis Simmons, read it. Like, read these books. Like, they might not be your traditional college textbook, but there's a lot to learn from the experience that these people went through when our field, our science, was a very young one and an experienced one. Like, they lived it, they lived through it, they pioneered, they survived to be able to tell the story and share their knowledge. So there's always plenty to recommend in learning from this old school classic readings in our field, for sure.
What about this notion? Because like not even just with books, but like, oh, this research was done. It wasn't done in the last 5 years, or oh, it was from the 2000s. Like, same thing about research. Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about one of our sponsors, Sleep Me. Sleep Me are the makers of the Chili Pad, which has been my bed cooling device since 2020. Chili Pad will allow you to sleep and not wake up hot anymore. This was something that I had to worry about. I used to have the air conditioning down way too low. Now, I don't have to have the air conditioning as low because my Chili Pad, my Dock Pro, keeps my bed cold at night. Check out Sleep Me, check out the Chili Pad, check out the Dock Pro in the link down below.
Crap. All crap. Like, research is research. If it's well done, it's well done. Physiology hasn't changed in the last 5 years. Yes, we might have different statistical means and methods to go about it, but listen, we're also smart enough to read and see and understand what we're dealing with. There's a lot of good knowledge in papers that were published 40 years ago. There's a lot of very good science in even like white papers that were published 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's about the quality of the research intervention and the method more than the actual tools used to do research. They're like, I always use this analogy, and people seems to resonate pretty well with it. Like, one of the oddest topics now in research, maybe not at the present moment, but in the last 5 years or so, is post-activation potentiation. Like every other topic you research, you first see a few papers, and then over the years you see maybe the first meta-analysis, and now you see, okay, now this is becoming like evidence-based. Now we have enough understanding of it to be able to like teach it and use it. And it's so fascinating how they go about like explaining the physiological aspects related to why we see a potentiation effect when we do certain protocols. And I don't want to go into the details, it's complicated stuff, but it's fascinating. It has to do with physiology and neuroanatomy, neurophysiology. It's very complicated stuff. But then you go back to like 1964, Verkhoshansky was talking about post-activation potentiation in his textbooks without a shred of evidence to support why it was working, but showing that it was working. And those protocols were nowhere different than the one that we use today. So, yes, the evidence were there to begin with. Maybe they were not as sound and as strong as they are nowadays, but they were there. I think it would be wonderful if instead of dismissing that all those old papers and articles, we would just try to bring them back to life and refresh them with more modern methods of doing research to support their claims, support their findings, and maybe use that our core backbone of knowledge to advance our industry today and our field today. Look at VBT. VBT is one of the oddest topics now, auto-regulation and all that stuff that comes with it. VBT has been done since the 60s, where they had to go frame by frame to measure velocity of each lift. Like, extensive work done by hand, where like research was at like it's in a very primordial phase. But the information they found back then are nowhere different than the one that we have today. When it looks at target velocity, velocity loss, effect in terms of adaptation, they got to the same findings with very little resources compared to what we have nowadays. So we need to respect research when it's done well and when it brings home some sort of practical applications. And I know maybe I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Paul Comfort. When he read Carmelo Bosco's book that I translated with Joseph, he was so impressed with the quality of this research, although it was done in the 70s and 80s, that he actually asked Joseph and myself to rewrite the book together, expanding on all those old topics in research with current evidence, just to show how good that research originally was. Yes, we know better now, but it hasn't changed the shape of what we do. Like, we still do strength and conditioning the same way. We just know a little bit better that allows us to be a little bit more accurate and precise with our intervention and more accurate and predictable with our outcomes. But it's still very good research, and it should still be considered, very much so, even by younger professionals.
Why would you say it's not?
I'll give you the only honest answer I can give you. I think it's a lot of egos getting in the way. There are, and I'll leave it like that. There are many different reasons why people get involved in teaching and research. Some of them are in this game, in this business for the right reasons, advancing the field, advancing the knowledge, mentoring and fostering future professionals. Others are in this business for their own private agenda. Let's put it that way. And publications have a lot to do with that. Like a lot of people fight or argue on who has more articles published, more citations, more awards or words of appreciation from other practitioners for how well their research is done and how much they publish. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that to push newer research, well, you kind of have to like forget about what has been done in the past to show how good the stuff that we do now is. So if you put your ego aside, your personal agenda aside, you might find a place as a researcher and as a practitioner without having to dismiss the quality of the work that has been done by people before you. Because again, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Like this is a field that has been walked before and has been explored before. There's very little new to find in strength and conditioning. We can just advance it, and we can advance it organically together. There's no need to discredit all research just to make a name for ourselves. We can do that in a much more constructive and inclusive manner, I think.
Talking about the ego, though, I think that that's probably one of the biggest things is like people want to get credit for doing something original. And so they'll maybe just like not reference things. But it's like if you think about a paper, like you have your ideas, you'll cite people, you'll have your references at the end. Ultimately, that paper and those are still your thoughts. But there, so few things are purely new and organic and never had been done before. Like just give credit to where credit's due, and then eventually people will still recognize it as like maybe your own thought. And like the reason I'm saying this is I've talked a lot about the power complex being a way to train power instead of doing Olympic lifts or mainly the clean. I tons of time be like, Jeff Jones taught me this. But I think a lot of people, because I so much will talk about it, like people talked about unilateral training before Mike Boyle talked about it. He quoted people, but nowadays it'll be like, hey, Mike Boyle was the single leg training guy. And he'll be like, I wasn't like, I just talked about it more than anybody else. You know what I mean?
Uh, I agree with you so much. And I hope I don't get anyone upset with this, but I'll give you a little.
It's okay
example.
if you do, like, because people, if they can't listen to a conflicting ideology, that's their problem.
I agree. Let me give you a simple example. Like the freaking isometric mid-type pull test. It's a great test. I love it. Great test. Very applicable. Very easy to do. Gives you a lot of insights on muscular performance and so far and so forth. People fight over it. People want to claim who invented it, who created it, who pioneered it, and so far and so forth. It's one of many isometric tests that have been done for generations of practitioners. And the same type of information you access with an isometric mid-type pull used to be accessed with different types of isometric testing, done with different exercises, looking at the same rate of force / rate of torque development curves over time. Is nothing new. You might have come with a better way of doing it, different way of doing it, great. But that doesn't make you the guy that invented the isometric mid-type pull. You exploited it, you use it in a different way, you spin a little bit of the way you go about like angles and positions and sampling frequency or whatever the case may be, but you haven't created anything new. Has been done that before. But that becomes a topic to claim a place at the table where probably you don't deserve one because you're just taking credit where credit is not due. Whereas if you're nicer about it and you just present your own way of doing things, citing and referencing people that have done that 20, 30 years before you, you look just as good as a practitioner and maybe a little bit of a better person when it comes to having less of an ego and more of an open-minded in discussing topics that are public domain and have been used for generations and generations and generations. And again, I hope I don't get anyone upset, but I've seen way too many people arguing over these topics over the years. It's kind of like, I'm fed up with that. Like, come on, guys, we can do better than this.
Speaking of the isometric mid-thigh pull, I had somebody that a colleague and I worked together with who said that the isometric mid-thigh pull was not like a valid or good enough test when we were trying to work through return to play stuff with somebody. And I'm like, how on earth are you saying this? Like, how crazy of a statement is that?
It is. What was their justification for that?
They didn't have one. They just didn't like that. So we were utilizing the isometric mid-thigh pull as a assessment with somebody that was coming back from a lower body injury, because we couldn't do other tests. We couldn't jump them. We couldn't maximally lift them, but it was safe enough to do an isometric mid-thigh pull, and we could do it unilateral, and we could get, kind of specific, not only just with an IMTP, but we would do some isometric training for that individual in a controlled setting. They're like, oh, that's not, they're just kind of like, they just said it. And we're like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Like, look at this research. And it was one of the most frustrating things we ever had to deal with.
Wait, the way you just explained why you use the isometric mid-thigh pull shows how valid of an option that is in the context that you presented it. So for anyone to say is not a valid option, that there's a probably an ego problem somewhere. You know, I'm gonna keep this very vague. I've attended events some 5 or 6 years ago where I've heard some of the most well-known and accredited practitioners in our field saying that velocity-based training is a toy. And that was at the forefront of a generation of researchers investing their money, time, and energy in researching velocity-based training. So I think there's a lot of egos in our industry, and when you're faced with them, you have to be very careful in the way you process their inputs and feedback.
Let's talk about your the book Applied Periodization from Ultimate Athlete Concepts. Like, let's tease that a little bit for people to and again, anybody that's listening right now, Ultimate Athlete Concepts, if you don't have any of their, like, the texts, Joseph, I mean, they're fantastic.
Yes. Well, thank you for mentioning the book. It was, I think the name says it all. Applied periodization. I think the problem, like, that's my, I put myself first in this scenario. Like, my problem growing up as a practitioner, from undergrad, so from the very beginning, for the very first steps I moved in this field, in this profession, was like, okay, like, I grew up in a generation where, like, Bompa was the godfather of periodization. So everyone was learning linear periodization in school, and we were reading the same textbooks and what have you. Nothing wrong with that, but I grew up in that generation where, like, okay, this is everything you need to know about periodization. This is your linear approach. This is your hypertrophy block. This is your strength block. This is your power block. That's how you program sets, reps, and loads. But then there was nowhere to find a way to learn how to take that knowledge and apply that into practice. Like, okay, now I know everything about it. What does that look in terms of, like, how many exercises? What exercises should I choose? Like, how do I manage those acute training variables over time to create that linear model that you're preaching about? And that even more confusion came about when, like, people start talking about, like, non-linear periodization, daily undulated periodization, and block periodization. And again, egos got involved, and people start making the claim that there's such a thing as the best way of doing periodization, which is blasphemy. There's no such a thing as the best way of doing periodization. For Christ's sake, we have tools nowadays that don't even require periodization anymore. Like, if you monitor your athletes well and you just apply the basic principles of progressive overload and fatigue management, you don't even have to worry about that much of a periodization approach to training. But that alone, my idea behind the book was to put in a manual more than a textbook format uh, notions of periodization, so looking at science, but always taking that notion and apply that into a practical program. So every model discussed in the book is followed up by a description of what a program looks like in terms of sets, reps, load, exercise selection, and so far and so forth, to kind of, like, bridge that gap and show that there's more than one way to skin a cat.
Amen. And that's, kind of the whole point of why we need to have those multiple ways, because, it needs to be applied, because it can't just be this idea of, like, things that work in theory, right? Like, the whole point of, I mean, even the basketball mechanics book here, it's like, hey, how can we talk about the things that actually happen doing the action, not like, oh, all this just hypothetical stuff, because that is where I think younger strength coaches will throw out the older and like, oh, they didn't. It's like, no, they did the thing. And they're writing down, like, their text is, this is what they did. Like, I think it was Joseph was talking about when Hank's book, like, he saw, like, Hank's book, Need for Speed. He's like, literally, I went and watched what they did at the track. He's like, and Hank's book was what they did. Like, that's
Yep.
like, I don't think coaches understand, like, young coaches understand, like, those old textbooks was literally coaches just be like, okay, let me put a nice version of all the stuff I did into this little spiral bound thing and give to people.
You know what's funny? That's awesome. Like, and Joseph and I discussed about that in the like several times. We did some work together with Professor Natalia Verkhojanski, which is Yuri Verkhojanski's daughter.
Yeah.
We look after some of her material or stuff that it was left behind from her dad's work, and we looked into these manuals that. So brief, very short history lesson. When Yuri Verkhojanski left Russia, he moved to Italy, and he was hired by the Italian Olympic Committee to work with Italian athletes, but even more so with Italian coaches. So Verkhojanski did not speak Italian, but he was supported by other Italian students or PhD students back in the 80s to write manuals for the Italian Olympic Committee on how to coach athletes better. So there's a line of manuals that Verkhojanski wrote in Italian that have never been published. And it's his original work. It's work that he did to teach Italian coaches how to become better coaches. I think I have close to like 9 or 10 manuals that he wrote. And this is nothing you find in Super Training or any other book that Verkhojanski has ever written. It's very good quality stuff. And like you said, is precisely what he was doing with his athletes in Russia. And the stuff that he has learned from his own research applied in a way that it was literally a plug in and play for the coaches. Read the textbook, go to the field, put this exercise in this order, and you're going to get a better athlete. It's as simple as that. And the funny thing is that this is what Yuri Verkhojanski wrote. Professor Natalia kind of like shadowed him a bit, but her interests were in a different field. She was more into tennis and other sports. So she never really had a full grasp of what like her dad was doing in terms of coaching. So when she sent me these original books, she asked me to look through them and try to put some order in the way Yuri Verkhojanski was creating the programs, like how many sets, what's the volume, what's the average intensity. So I pretty much reverse engineered his programming through these textbooks, and then I show her the results that she was pretty amazed with that. So we figured out that the way Verkhojanski was doing strength and conditioning back in the days was quite the opposite of what people expect from the Soviet system. Like when we think about the Soviet system, we think about high volume, high frequency, high tonnage, like overtraining and performance enhancing drugs and all that good stuff. Well, that was not possible in Italy. And that was different than the way they were doing stuff in Russia. And the way Verkhojanski adapted these programs in Italy were very much chasing after microdosing and the minimum effective dose, which is exactly what we preach about today. Very low volume, very low, extremely low compared to what people expect it to be. Very high intensity, like I didn't even consider a working set below 85% on 1 rep max, whether you were a cross country runner or a sprinter. So when it was strength training, it was very heavy strength training. A lot of plyometrics, not just the depth jumps. We all think about Verkhojanski as being the godfather of high impact plyometric and the shock method. True. But he was doing stuff like cluster sets when he was doing plyometric training. He was doing different ways of going about extensive plyometrics as well, unilateral work. They were extremely effective, also in extremely high volume compared to what we consider to be the guidelines for plyometric training. We normally refer to like the NSCA textbook and we see like, oh, 120, 180 contacts per session. Yeah, as a starting point. There were athletes doing 500 contacts per session when it comes to plyometric training, because these were jumpers and sprinters and runners. So plyometric was very much embedded into their daily training. So they were used to it. So one thing that is very strong in evidence from this textbook is just there's not such a thing as like too much training, as long as you stay within, of course, physiological common sense, if you will. It's just a matter of developing over time that capacity to tolerate that load and adapt to it. Like if you look at some of Verkhojanski's original work, they were training twice a week for maybe 45 minutes, doing 5, 6 sets of back squat and an handful of sets of depth jumps. That was their starting point. But then you would see these programs in a 5 year, 6 year, 10 years trajectory where they were doing 4 times a week in the weight room, squatting heavy, doing plyometrics 4 times a week for 300, 400, 500 contacts a session. So it's about that repeated bout effect. When you expose your system to systemic training and you allow adequate time to recuperate and regenerate from a training session, well, you develop that work capacity that brings you to be able to tolerate more work without the need for performance enhancing drugs. Everything is there in this original textbook. It's amazing to see how simple they were, and there's plenty to recommend. So I'm sorry I took you to a long journey away from your question, but like that to me was a massive learning experience, and it did change a lot the way I go about program design with my own athletes in my day-to-day job. So plenty to recommend. I hope Joseph and I will get to a point where we can make these manuals available in English, because they're absolutely awesome.
No, I mean, Joseph and I have talked about how Strength Coach Network and Ultimate Athlete Concepts can work together to bring these things to life. And whether it be like, maybe it's not just manuals, maybe we start creating courses where we're, because that way coaches can start to, okay, let's make them some digestible courses. And then eventually the courses lead into the books that they can purchase. And but there's so everybody, like, you're getting a little bit of a tease, everybody, but Ultimate Athlete Concepts and Strength Coach Network, like, you're going to see something coming from the two of us, just because of, again, we put our money where our mouth is. Like, I believe in those texts. I have literally looking at them in my office right here. But one of the things that I wrote down as you were talking was this whole notion of the contacts. And to me, like, I'll start with the first question. How do you handle the notion of, like, okay, within the foot contacts during a training session, plyometric, running is plyometric too. Do you take that into account, like each of their steps when they're sprinting within the warm-up? Like, get into the weeds here, because I'm gonna hop in the weeds with you too, and our listeners, hop in. Like, let's figure this out. Let's talk about this from somebody with your level of expertise and knowledge, because I want to be educated. Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about one of our sponsors, Powerlift. Powerlift is located here in Iowa in the United States of America. I've utilized them back in 2011 when I had them at Harvard. I also had them at the University of Maryland, and then finally when I was at the University of Iowa. Their equipment is strong, it is durable, it is dependable. It's also customizable based upon whatever your needs are at your school. Check out Powerlift at the link down below.
I hope I can share a little bit of experience with you. I don't think I have much to educate you about, but we can learn something together, maybe. This is my approach, and it's my way of looking at things. Not sure it's the best way, as the one that worked for me so far. Let's give you an example. Track and field. I've done a lot of work with throwers, but let's take a sprinter, for instance, just to keep it as pertinent as to your example as possible. So sprinters, guess what? They sprint. That's their sport. That's what they do. They do that for technical reasons. So part of their training is technique based. Part of their training is to drive actual adaptation. So they train for speed, they train for power, they train for explosiveness. Some of that is for running mechanics and what have you. And on top of that, there's going to be a component of strength training that needs to be implemented as well. Well, okay, what is the one thing that these athletes cannot get away from? Spending time sprinting, running, and doing speed-related tasks and drills. So we can count all their steps and turn that into a very structured approach to, okay, every sprinting is plyometric, and we can count every single foot contact and count that into the equation. We could do that. But even if we did, unless we're also coaching them on the track, we will have very little control of what's happening when they go out and run and sprint. Like, it's their coach's job to take care of that. But we can acknowledge what they do, see what they don't do, and fit our intervention into context in that sense. Meaning, yes, what they do is plyometric, but is it the same type of plyometrics that we can do in the weight room to promote a higher level of structural and functional adaptation? No, because it's always a plyometric done at speed. It's always extensive. It's always like multiple efforts. They don't really do much of like depth jump stuff on the field. They don't do much about heavy lifting on the field. So let's start focusing on what we can give them that their coaches don't give them. Let's see what we can do, where we can tap into to raise the ceiling and build even more strength and more power than then they can use on the field when they have to sprint, run, and whatever they have to do. So instead of like factoring in everything they do, which would be excruciating pain to chase after all different types of drills and exercise they do when they practice, let's look at what they don't do in their day-to-day practice, and let's try to give them that in the weight room. So sprinters don't do depth jumps. Let's program depth jump in the weight room. Sprinters don't do a lot of heavy lifting on the field. Let's give them heavy squats. And that's exactly what Verkhoshansky was doing. Like when you, and Bondarchuk for that matters, and Bosco, like all the researchers and practitioners of the same generations, like they knew what the athletes were getting on the field, where they were throwers, jumpers, sprinters, team sports athletes. They knew what they needed, so they knew what they, physiologically speaking, what were the characteristics they needed to perform at their best in their sports. They were just giving them in the weight room whatever they were not getting on the field in a way that was very easy to quantify and manage. Because yes, we can be as creative as we want in creating and designing a program, but if we can't control it, measure it, and take corrective actions where things are not going the way we want, we're pretty much probably making more damage than anything. So I think a good idea is to always, always look at what they do when they practice, whatever sport we're dealing with. Always try to find a way to quantify that load in a way that is meaningful for us, whether it's like hours on the field, contacts, uh, like if you're wearing like a wearable device, strain levels, whatever the case may be. But then take that as a whole, like as a big piece of information, factor that in into our training intervention, and focus on what we can give them that they don't get to make them better. I hope that answered your question somehow.
No, it does. I mean, we're bucket fillers, and that's why like the question. Then I'm also thinking is like, all right, because Nick DeMarco and I we worked together at Iowa, and this was a conversation that he and I had where he's like how he wanted to with his PhD, and then eventually come up with some sort of like a tool for coaches is like, if there's these, you know, 200 to 300 foot contexts, it's like, all right, how can you quantify different, you know, a box jump versus a depth drop versus a drop jump versus, you know, rudiments, single leg, unilateral, single leg, bilateral, you know, split stance, rotational, lateral, like all of those different factors obviously weight it because, okay, if I do a depth jump from 60 inches, like my goodness, the magnitude of GRF versus a rudiment double leg, like it can't be that. So is there value in your opinion of coming up with some sort of a nominal scale to the value of those different types of jumps?
It's a great question. Um, I think there is a value in trying to, if you will, standardized intensity metrics for this type of exercises. Um, I think though, I think there is value, very much so. But the problem I see as a practitioner though, and as a practitioner that makes a whole lot of use of like depth jumps and heavy squats and Olympic lifts and all that good stuff, it can be deceiving to look at one of these exercise in isolation and try to focus too much on the intensity we're generating. I think there's more practical value in looking at the systemic effect of a training intervention based on these exercise on the athletes. And for what I mean for that, I'll give you a very practical example. Like the way I fine tune my own way of going about program design or coaching is like I have my, like you said, I have my buckets. I know that I have my Olympic lift, I have my core lift, I have my plyometrics, intensive plyometric, extensive plyometrics, and I have my own style of putting exercise together for a training program. Well, I put together my training program. I fit in the volume and the intensity I deem appropriate for each athlete. And then I just look at the effect of it. I look at how much fatigue I generated and how quickly the athlete could recuperate from that fatigue and come back to a higher level of performance. And that happens by monitoring athletes over time. That's something I constantly do. If there's one thing I do when it comes to sports science, it's simply monitoring fatigue. I think if you can, because what is fatigue? When you measure fatigue, you're measuring the effect of your training intervention as a whole, the totality of it. Yes, you might have done one exercise that was more intense than the other, but the effect is still systemic. So if you can see, okay, you have a single bout of training, and that bout of training is represented by a number of different exercises, and the total effect led to a decrease in performance that lasted for 36, 48 hours, and a rebound that was persistent for another 24 to 48 hours. And when I came back to the weight room, I was actually in a better place than the first time I went to the weight room. So that actually improved my performance. That tells me that whatever I did in that intervention was well suited to the athlete. And that brings me to a point where, like, I think it's very difficult to standardize plyometric training because every athlete is different. Every athlete has a different ceiling when it comes to eccentric load and overload, rate of force development, reactive training, like coordination, like all those elements that contribute to performance in plyometric type exercises. So standardizing a way to measure intensity might be tricky, would be great, but just tricky. I feel like looking at the systemic effect on a one by one cases will give you more insights on your training tools.
Yeah, because as you were talking, I'm thinking like, all right, let's call a rudiment, like a double leg rudiment forward is a value of 1, and then a double leg rudiment, lateral is worth 2, rotational is worth 2. But if it was single leg, it went up from forward is 2 to lateral is a 3, and you start coming up with these scores, and then you're like, okay, if you're going to do a box jump from this height to this height, it's worth this number, and you just kind of come up with something. But it's just like, now you start to assign the value. And the reason that I ask this all is pertaining to the fact of working in high performance, where let's say somebody is an athletic trainer or a physio, or they had a CSCS and they're like, wait a minute, we're not supposed to do more, or hey, that's not enough foot contacts, we need more foot contacts. It's like, okay, but we got like 12 depth drops from 50 inches. Like, you see some of those videos from back in the day of like people stepping off the top of the bleachers and jumping over like 5 feet hurdles. It's like, yeah, you're not going to do 200 of those. You know what I mean? So it's just finding a way to communicate it best in this new high performance world where people don't understand the value of a rudiment as extensive before we get extensive before we get into our intensive work.
Yeah, and like you brought up a great point. And when people ask me why, this goes to like athletic trainer, physical therapist, other coaches, doesn't matter. When they ask, why don't you do this instead? Like, why don't you do, like, I do a lot of depth jumps with my athletes, a lot of them. And usually the bare minimum, like, box height is 4 feet, 5 feet. And we go pretty high off season.
Yeah.
And when they ask me, like, what do you do that instead of doing, I don't know, a clean or a loaded jump or some other alternative exercise? My answer is, as long as I can as long as I can measure progress and that progress is real and tangible, why would I change what I do? I will question it when I don't see progress anymore. When I stop seeing progress, then I will question what I do. My pursuit of progress is twofold. First, by default, I go back to the bare minimum. I'm a huge fan of the minimum effective dose across the board for everything. Start from the bare minimum, because you know that that's the bare minimum that anyone needs to get stronger, get more explosive, get faster. Work on a well-rounded training program that includes all elements of strength and power, put it on paper, execute it, and start measuring progress. As long as you see a change in performance, what you're doing is working. Don't complicate things, don't increase
Yeah.
volume, don't increase complexity. Complexity and volume must be earned. You have to use them when the athletes need them. There's no need to complicate things. They don't need to change things if things are working. Just we try to do evidence based in the sense that we do evidence to show what's the bare minimum to promote adaptation, what's the best practice when it comes to designing a training program. Put that on paper, let it run for a little bit, like 3, 4, 6 weeks, whatever the case may be. Measure progress or lack of progress, and then decide if you need to do something about it. Don't just assume things need to change, because we're all going to be looking at the same program in different ways. An athletic trainer will look through his own or her own lenses. Physical therapy is the same, strength coach the same, and even if you were to pick 5 different strength and conditioning coaches in the same room, they would go about program design in completely different ways because of their backgrounds. Some people are more into Olympic lifts, some people are more into plyometric, some people are more into bodybuilding or powerlifting. There's no the best way to go about program design. Is the effect that we get. We have to keep that pragmatic aspect of our profession. Are we creating a positive change? Are we making the athletes better? And that brings me to a different topic that I hope you have a minute to discuss.
Go ahead.
Because right now we are in that weird limbo / transition between strength and conditioning and sports science, where like everything needs to be statistic, everything needs to be data driven, which is great. But let me tell you, like, if you train your athletes for 6 weeks and you put them back on force plates and their jump height hasn't improved, their rate of force development hasn't improved, and then you come to me and say, yeah, but if you look at this one random metric out of 260 metrics that the force plates are showing, and that one metric improved, that means that we're doing something right. Then you're forcing results. You're biased. You're skewing perspective. Like, you need to be pragmatic. There's an handful of metrics that matter in performance. It's about power, rate of force development, symmetry. That's also very important, and strength and speed. If you're doing speed testing, if you're not improving those core variables, those core metrics, you're not really doing your job. You're not getting the job done. You're looking for a way to prove that what you're doing works somehow, but probably doesn't. Because then those athletes will need that power, will need that rate of force development. And if you can't measure a positive change on a force plate, how do you expect to see a change in performance on the field of play? It's not going to happen. So we need to be we need to keep our feet to the ground and be very much task oriented and pragmatic. Like, that's what I love about sports like track and field, or even motorsport for that matters. The stopwatch is always right. If the athlete is not going faster, it is not going faster. There's no way around it. And if we can show that there's a progress happening that is getting that athlete faster, all those other metrics are just background noise. We need to focus with the essentials, on the essentials. And some of the researchers like Bishop has done a phenomenal job in saying, okay, guys, we get 300 metrics out of a counter movement jump on a force plate, but probably the metrics that really matters are like 5 or 6. Let's focus on those. Let's make sure that our training programs are affecting those metrics. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's fine, because what I wrote down earlier when you talked about sports science measuring fatigue is like, what does sports science mean to you from somebody that has seen so much? Like, it's gotten to the point where, in my opinion, sports science has removed the individual, which is the biggest problem. Like, you can never remove the individual in a field where we work with people, and not to measure the fact that it's a human being that's giving you those numbers. Like, you're a researcher, I'm a researcher. It's mixed methods. It's not just quantitative in the numbers. It's not just qualitative in what they're telling you. It's a mixed methods, and you can't have one without the other, because without that context, it means nothing.
I so much agree with you. And you know what the sad thing is that on one end, sports science is removing the individuals that we're training, like that subjective component that comes with training, which is not always exclusively quantitative or qualitative, like you said. It's not always physiology. It's not always biomechanics. It's psychology. It has to do with emotions, with feelings, with motivation. There's a lot that goes into it. The numbers will never be able to quantify. So they're eliminating that. But what makes me even more upset is that he's eliminating the subjective component on our end of the job. We are the software. We are the brain power behind our training programs. We can't rely on a $5,000 software to tell us how to do our job. We can't rely on artificial intelligence to tell us how to do our job. We are the software. We make the calls. We run the show. Like, it's great to use data. It's excellent to use data. And sports science has a lot of value because it's measuring the effect of our interventions. It's measuring the effect on fatigue and on performance. If we can control fatigue and performance, we have full control of the game. Now we know what game we're playing. Now we know if we put together X, Y, and Z, that's going to be the effect on fatigue. It's going to last that long. It's going to have that long-term effect on performance. It's going to have that effect on like risk of injury. We can quantify the effect of our intervention. But we create the interventions, and we do that talking and listening to our athletes. They are the main characters in our show. We are a supportive role. We are the catalyst for them to express their potentials. We can't eliminate that from the equation. Like, it's not quantifiable. It comes down to it's a people business. We work with people. We work with human beings with their problems and their limitations, complex systems, chaotic system where there's very little predictability. Very little is predictable about what we do. Sports science fills that gap where it makes it that much more predictable, that makes our life a little bit easier. That's the extent of it. I'm not expecting anyone, with all the due respect, anyone with a degree in statistics or in astrophysics or whatever the case may be, to come and tell me how to do my job. I am the practitioner. I run the show. Maybe tell me what I can do better, but it's my job, it's my show, I run it. You tag along if you want, and we work together to make the process better. Don't let them tell you what to do. We are the coaches, they are the analysts.
Speaking of making the process better, from somebody that has been, in the field for a while, seen it in multiple, international stage, where do you see strength and conditioning going in the next 3, 5, 10 years?
That's a wonderful question. What I hope is going to go in the next 5 to 6, 10 years, I hope we can finally come together under the same roof, strength and conditioning, sports science, and physical therapy in a truly integrated manner. Where, and for integrated manner, I don't mean practitioners stepping on each other's toes, but instead practitioners speaking the same language so there can be communication and integration in the approach that we use to work with athletes. I feel like we as strength and conditioning coaches have a lot to offer, and we earn our place to the table. Physical therapists has a lot to offer as well, because return to sport, injury management, pain management is a huge component of what we do in performance. And sports science as well has a lot to offer, because again, like we just said, it's important to have those metrics available when we need them. What's lacking now is that integration, and the integration comes with communication. We need to be able to know enough. That's a thing I hammer constantly when I go, especially overseas. We need to know enough about the other people's job to be able to communicate with them. We need to know what physical therapists see and understand and think, to be able to think their way and communicate with them. They need to know what we see and we understand, so that they can communicate with us. And that comes with, and I'll say that over and over again, with respecting each other's professional skills. If we respect each other's profession and upbringing in terms of like schoolwork and academics and work experience and internships, then we can have this integrated approach. If we keep looking at each other's like, oh, I'm better than you because I went to this school, that school, I have my PhD, you don't, I have my doctorate in physical therapy, you don't, well, we're not going anywhere. We need to respect each other's job from the undergraduate level, from the assistant coach to the head of sports medicine, respect each other's job and place at the table, and have a true integrated approach that is ultimately looking after the athletes, because that's what we're here for.
I mean, that's what it's all about. Like you said, I love the fact about like we have to know enough so we can communicate and we play in the sandbox together well enough, because if you don't have a base level of knowledge of what they're doing, you can't then progress it and have the higher level conversation to then ultimately make things better for the athlete.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. I really think, and I mean it. Like I feel like strength and conditioning coaches, physical therapists, and sports scientists, and of course like orthopedic doctors and whatnot, have never been this well educated on the topics that they deal with. Like we do great, excellent in education. We just don't educate each other on what the other practitioners are doing and how other practitioners sees or may see the same issue. If we can bridge that gap in communications, then we can truly create an integrated system. And that integrated system builds on strengths that ultimately benefit our athletes. And I think that's a game changer.
That's where we have to get strength coaches all on the same page too, though, and like call
Sure.
things what they are. Like we can't. I mean, for the love of God, when I was working at Towson, I had coaches calling something a back squat, where at best it was a Cal Dietz sport squat, and they had hands on the bar, and it's just like, please stop calling that a back squat. And then they were like, well, we should like collect all the data from all the different athletes and be able to compare like the field hockey athlete's squat versus the volleyball player. I was like, one, massive difference. Two, you don't squat your athletes to parallel. Three, you're putting your hands on the bar. Like, why would we do that? We have like, can we please start calling the thing that it is? You know,
Can I add one little thing? Sorry, but
please do. Go
it's
ahead.
it's something I really struggle a lot when I talk to other practitioners. Like, also, can we just be honest and name things for what they are? If you say something is heavy, can we all agree on what heavy means? Because you can call an 85% back squat, barbell back squat, as heavy as a single leg body weight squat for 30 reps. Because it's creating effort doesn't mean it's heavy. There's effort, there's load, there's adaptation. They're all different aspects of the same process, but they're different. And if
Okay.
we don't even agree on that, like how can we really communicate? Like you can't tell me that a bodybuilding type of exercise is as heavy as a powerlifting type exercise. It's different type of metabolic stress. It's different type of mechanical tension involved. Uh, it's not better or worse. They're different. They're simply different. We just need to agree that they're different and call them for what they are. I'm not talking about better or worse. I'm just talking about different, but being aware of that difference and how that difference come into play when it comes to program design, because that eliminates a lot of confusion and background noise that a lot of young practitioners struggle with, because when they think about heavy strength training and then they come to you with a set of step ups for 20 reps with a 10 pounds dumbbell for a 220 pounds lineman, it's not heavy strength training. It's not going to get the effect that you expect to get. Therefore, it's not going anywhere. If we agree on terminology and we agree on good practice, we're going to do a much better job.
Amen to that, brother. Unifying the voice, unifying our terminology. That's exactly what we need. Everybody that has listened to us talk for the last over hour, we greatly appreciate you. Antonio, I could have talked to you for another 2 hours, like, but I want to respect your time. Your daughter's going to be waking up here soon. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for dropping knowledge and helping me get better. Yeah, man, this has been a blast.
Thank you for having me. And if you don't mind, like I'll show you. I have my daughter on the radar sleeping. I don't know if you can see her.
I got
She's
you.
in the next
There
room.
you
I timed her
go.
nap perfectly to cover our podcast, so it worked out great. That shows you I really meant to me to be in the show, on the show with you, and how much I really appreciate you rescheduling that with me for the little glitches that we had when we were in it when I was in Italy. So thank you for working with me on that.
You're welcome. And like I said, it's valuable for me to be able to learn from you. So thank you so much, brother. And you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you so much for having me.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.